from the break. I'm excited to be here. My name is Vojta, and I'll be talking about localizing React Native apps. Firstly, something about me. You can find me on Twitter and on GitHub at Vojtech Novak. I'm a maintainer of a few React Native related libraries, such as React Native Google Sign-In, the Datetime Picker repo, Document Picker, and then also, most recently, I have released React Native Theme Control, where I'm running a bit of an experiment because it's currently for my GitHub sponsors only until, I'm going to open source it when I reach my sponsorship goal. So that's an experiment. And I want to start off this talk by kind of giving you a promise that, regardless of whether you are a starting developer or maybe a senior developer, I really hope that, you will learn something new today and take something away. And so in this talk, I'll be talking about, I'll be doing a quick comparison of some libraries that you can use to localize your apps. I'll also be talking about some mistakes that happen in the translation process and how to prevent them, what you should or maybe you should not do to help translators deliver the best result possible. And I want to shed some light on what tools the translators themselves are using, because I think it's important for us also to understand how they work in order for us to do our job better. All right, you might think, what's the deal? We're translating strings and localizing apps like every day. No, that's kind of a solved problem, no? And, well, maybe not necessarily, As I was preparing for this talk, I was collecting some screenshots of mistakes that I have seen that happened to someone else or maybe to me. And this is the first example from the PayPal website. You'll see that at the top arrow, there's this blue outline. That's a button, actually, and it has no text, no label whatsoever. And then at the bottom, the arrow is pointing at a button which is localized into Czech, which is my first language. But the rest of the UI is in English. So you see that something is in Czech, something is in English, something is missing completely. And it's just not the kind of experience that you would expect. Another example is, you're trying to localize some string and then maybe call some string method on it. But the string is not there, and it ends up with a runtime crash. This is probably the worst thing that can happen to you, and I don't even know how it happened to me, but in theory, obviously, it apparently can happen. This is another example from the VS Code website, where I ran it in the browser, and there was this alert that you see in the middle, and you see that some of the labels have not resolved to an actual English word or an English sentence. The only button there is the cancel button, which is an actual, the correct translation. But the rest of it are just like translation keys or translation identifiers. And this is still much better than not having any translation at all. But it's, not quite there yet. And so I just got curious about the topic, and I also even more than 2 years ago already, I asked on Twitter what folks were using for localizing stuff. I got some interesting responses, and in the end, here I am. All right, quickly about some of the localization libraries, and there's a bunch of them. So I had to, make some choice, and I plotted on this npm downloads graph the 4 libraries that kind of came to my mind. From the top, the most popular one is React I18 Next. The next one is React Intel. And at the bottom, the blue line is a Lingui library, which is kind of nice, I think. And all the way at the bottom is FBT, which is a library from Facebook, actually. So these two are like floating under the radar, really. But I needed to pick some libraries for the comparison that I wanted to make, so I picked the most popular and the least popular in terms of number of downloads, which is I18 Next and FBT. And the demo is available, or will be available at this URL. And the demo app looks like this. It's just a very simple app that I have built just to play around. And so at the top, it's divided into 2 parts. They're both the same. At the top, the UI is built using FBT, and at the bottom, the UI is built using I18 Next. So let's have a look at some code, and this is the FBT component. I'll start, slowly from the top. So at the beginning, there's a string which just contains the current date formatted as time with hours and minutes. So it might be, for example, 10 a.m. a string, and then I have a constant number of people watching. Oh, actually, let me go back here. I just want to point out what use cases I'm covering here. So, at the top, the first sentence is just a very simple static string. And the second one has a number inside of the sentence. So this sentence is here to showcase pluralization support. The third sentence has the date at the end of the sentence. So this is here to show sort of parameter or variable inside of the translation. And the fourth sentence at the bottom is here to showcase sort of a complex sentence, let's say, complex sentence where parts of the sentence are styled differently. And yeah, sorry for the bad example. It was just like the first example that came up to my mind. Metastock is actually down today, so sorry. But these are the most common scenarios that you'll probably encounter. And so, looking at the code, the important part is the text label. I mean, the Welcome to React Native EU label. And you see that the way FBT works is that it just wraps the text inside of the FBT component, and you pass the description prop, which is mandatory actually. And the description is there for the translator to give them more context about what this string is, and it helps the translator translating it properly. Next sentence was the one with plurals. Now, if you're not familiar with plurals, what I'm talking about is, in languages, when you have some quantities or numbers in sentences, the sentence can take sort of different shape. In English, there are two forms. There's singular and plural. Like you have one car, you have two cars, and those are the two forms that are there. But other languages have different numbers of forms. For example, my language has like 4 or 5. Or for example, Japanese doesn't have any. They just don't have plural forms. They have just like one. And so in the code, we somehow have to account for this. And this is the way that FBT handles it. Again, you start with the FBT component, and you sort of plug in the plural component to express the number using the component. And so this is going to, based on the variable, it's going to render either, like one of these sentences, let's say. For example, you have one person watching, or you have 2 people watching, where, well, there's more, luckily. All right, the next example. Yeah, let's make some space. Next example was with the parameter at the the date at the end of the sentence. And again, this is the way FBT handles it. There's a FBT param component, and inside as a child of this component, you pass the actual value of the variable. And then finally, the complex sentences, as I have called it. Here I'm making use of nesting text components in React Native. If you're not familiar with how it works, basically you can nest text components and give a variable styling to parts of the sentence, and this is what it's going to look like in the end. And the result is then wrapped by the FBT component again. And the really important and crucial part here is that you wrap the entire sentence with the FBT component, because then it's going to extract the entire sentence from the sources, and it's going to keep it as one piece, and then the translator can translate it properly. Whereas if you were to break it down or break it up into different pieces, you will not get a quality translation. All right, just quickly, this is what the So FBT runs through your code and extracts the strings out of it. This is what the result. This is what part of the resulting JSON file looks like. It's kind of a proprietary format, I guess, of Facebook that they have developed to like serve their purpose. And next is the I18 Next example. Again, the beginning is kind of the same thing. So let's jump straight to the interesting part, which is the text label again. So here I'm calling the T function, and I'm passing 2 parameters. The first one is the message ID, and the second is the default value. So I18X is putting more emphasis sort of on using these like handwritten, let's say, translation IDs, whereas FBT is generating these IDs. The next example is the plural. And here you'll notice it looks quite a bit different from FBT. And again, depending on if it's one person or some different number of people watching, it's going to render either one of those translations. But you'll see here that there's, like, I guess two differences. One is that the sentences here are like written out in their entirety. So you have the entire sentence sort of written twice, and there's some overlap. There's some duplication between the 2 sentences. That's the first observation. And the second observation is that I18X is using this convention of their own that they use double curly braces to wrap the count placeholder, which will be replaced by the actual variable at the runtime. Again, this is the sentence with the time at the end, so using a variable. And this time, again, we're using the double curly braces convention, sort of, that I18X has. And just quickly, this is the JSON file that I18X is going to spit out when you extract the strings. This is what it's going to look like by default, but I18X supports also other formats. To wrap this up quickly, the comparison, I would say, FBT, the pros, what I like about it is that the source code of your app is kind of easily searchable. Just by Command F, you can find the pieces of strings that you're looking for. Whereas, if you're using I18X and you have the translation keys, which are some identifiers, you will not find the translation or the strings themselves in the sources. Also, what's interesting about FBT is the support for commands for translators, and as I said before, they are required. Also, FBT has a smaller bundle size, but there are some cons, as we have seen before. The community is much smaller. It requires Babel to extract the sentences out of the strings. So maybe if you're using SWC, you will not be able to use it. And Facebook has developed their own file format that serves their needs. And as I was looking at different translation tools, I think probably only Crowden supports FBT file format. Otherwise, if you send it to some translator, they will probably say like, "Oh, I've never seen this before." I18X, has sort of the opposite. Large community, many plugins. It's been around for probably a decade or so. So they probably covered all sorts of scenarios that they ran into. And it's also unopinionated, so you can use whatever tooling you want. The cons that I have, personally picked is that some of the APIs kind of feel unsafe with these double curly braces. If you make a mistake there, the translations are probably not going to, they're not going to render correctly. And also, it has a larger bundle size. I will not be able to say which one is better. I just can't. It really depends on your use cases. But these were just some my personal observations. So next, about some translation services. Sometimes they're also called CAT tools, which unfortunately has nothing to do with cats. CAT stands for computer-aided translation. And my only point here is that don't use email or spreadsheets or some other, I don't know, ways that you're communicating with your translators, because These tools are cloud tools. They're developer friendly. They have CLIs, APIs, GitHub integrations. They allow you to hire translators. They're just going to make the process much smoother for you. So just to mention a few, there's Crowdin, Phrase, or Localize, which is by the creators of i18next. So it's definitely going to work well together. All right. As I promised, I wanted to talk about how translators work. So let's have a look at some of the things inside of the translators toolbox. And the first one I'm going to mention is translation memory. Translation memory is essentially a database of all the translations that your agency or translator have created. This doesn't sound terribly useful at first, but trust me that it is. Imagine, for example, that you have a website which is already up and running, and then your company decides to create a mobile app for the same service. And it doesn't matter what technology they're using. Basically, you're going to build out the app, and some of the strings inside of the app are going to be probably very similar or maybe even the same as in the web app. And so as you translate these new strings and you use the translation memory, because many are going to be the same, you're going to get them translated from the translation memory just like this, zero effort. Next tool is machine translation. I think this is kind of obvious because machine translation has become much more mature and viable in the past few years. And oftentimes translators use it to sort of get a quick translation for a string, and then maybe they look at some mistakes that need fixing and just polish the result of the machine translation. Next one is term-based, and so I'm going to explain this by an example. Imagine, you're Apple, the company Apple, and you have a bunch of strings, in your software, in your terms of service or whatever, where the word Apple is mentioned. And if you translate these strings, maybe using machine translation, chances are that the machine translation is going to translate the word Apple into the language, into the target language. But the word Apple here is not an apple, it's the name of a company. You don't want to translate it. So what you can do is create a term in a term base, and the term is going to be Apple, and you're going to flag it as a non-translatable term. And then whenever the translator, by mistake, translates the word Apple, it's going to scream at him and be like, hey, you probably don't want to translate this word. And this is related to quality assurance. Quality assurance is going to scream at you. This is a bad translation. But quality assurance can also, catch typos, or maybe if you have parameter in the source sentence and you missed it in the target sentence, it's going to also flag, these mistakes. There are workflow steps that you can use. And as an example, there might be pre-translation from translation memory or from machine translation. Then maybe you'll have an actual human being edit the strings, fix some mistakes. And maybe the last step of the workflow steps can be you as a client having a look at the translations and be like, yeah, this is good job. Approve it. And the last tool I want to mention, which kind of integrates all of these, is a translation editor, which is kind of, can look like this, and it's kind of an IDE that the translators use. And there's really some interesting, comparisons maybe with the IDEs that we are using. If you look at the red rectangles, there's autocomplete. So translators can use autocomplete. It's kind of like IntelliSense maybe. There's also machine translation, which maybe can be like GitHub Copilot for translators. And there's also the quality assurance here, which maybe can be compared with ESLint. And the last thing I highlighted here is screenshot management, which I will talk about later. So what about some of the common mistakes that happen? This is the first one, concatenating messages. I have a screenshot from booking.com just to point out that it can happen really to everyone. I don't want to go into the details of the sentence, but it's sufficient to say that the sentence is not completely correct. And I have a hypothesis about how it was created. They had error object and something was missing, and they just concatenate these things together, like location is missing or date is missing. But this might work in some languages. It might work in English, but it's very, very likely that it's not going to work in other languages. So, and I think this approach stems from us developers hating duplication. We try to avoid it at all costs, and we often follow this principle of don't repeat yourself. But with translations, it is oftentimes the case that you actually want to be wet. You actually want to write everything twice rather than not repeating yourself. And I should make a note here, because actually FBT has a special component to avoid some of these duplications. But so having some abstraction to avoid duplication, there's a cost of having the abstraction. So personally, I feel like writing out some of the strings 2 times is actually not a big deal if what you get is a quality translation in the end. So the next mistake is like missing translations. And I don't know how this happened. This was a screenshot from a website, but for example, i18x has TypeScript support, so it can flag if you're trying to reference missing keys. There's always fallbacks, so you can fall back maybe to the translation key, like we saw in the Visual Studio Code website. If you're working with some complex translations, you can always write component tests. And finally, I want to say, like completely missing translations probably will not happen in React Native. This is screenshots from the web, where I feel like the story is probably more complex. You can fetch translation strings at the runtime and so on. Whereas in React Native, you will probably bundle all the translations together with your app at the build time. Where I just want to make one note, like if you're bundling the translations with your React Native app, it's going to work okay if you have, let's say, 5 or 6 translations. But maybe if you're a big company and you have 100 translation files, bundling them inside of JavaScript is probably not going to work well. All right, missing message context. And I've been talking about context a lot, and I will still be talking about context. But here, imagine for a second that you are a translator, and you're translating from English to Czech, and you're translating the word German. It's just one word, right? It can be too difficult. But maybe you don't know Czech, so you call me up because I'm Czech, and you ask me, hey, what's the translation here? And I'm going to say, well, I don't know. It really depends. It depends on the context. And so here, to give an answer, it might maybe German is a noun, in which case it might be either one of these translations. But maybe the word German here is an adjective, in which case it might be one of these 3 words. So you have at least 6 possible translations for one word, and it all depends on context. And there are different ways to add context. This is on the web. This is a tool this is in-context translation tool from phrase in this example, where the translator can run the website and translate, like select the strings and translate them in place using this sort of iframe that phrase is providing. And they will see all the strings in context, and they can translate them right in place, which is that's the best way to translate stuff for the translator. But this is probably not going to work for React Native. For React Native, I think there's a different way, and which is adding context at design time. And sorry for the poor screenshot, but the point here is that the first person probably working on the experience of your app is a designer. And designer goes in Figma, and they design the components there. And already at that time, they can see that maybe some string is okay in English, but it's too long in German, and they can redesign the experience. When they connect Figma with machine translation, they can get quick feedback on the design. And already at that time, they can define the translation keys, and they can also upload screenshots of their designs from Figma inside of these translation tools. And then when the translator comes to do their job, they have the necessary context. So I think this is a pretty cool tooling. And sort of the overarching message that I want to send here is having quality strings or having quality in general implies trustworthiness. And you probably don't want your users to not understand your app, because you're going to get bad reviews, and ultimately it's going to affect your business as well. All right, finally, well, let's also talk about localizing native stuff, because after all, we're doing native apps. On iOS, this is kind of the fastest way to get or set the localization of your app. And personally, I recommend this is going to set it sort of in the settings, and I recommend taking this place as the source of truth for all your localizations, because otherwise you might end up with a broken UI like over here, because some parts of the app are controlled and rendered by you. So you see some parts of the app are in English, but there's also parts of the app that you do not control, such as the context menu on the text input, which here is in Chinese. So you have here, in this case, you have sort of two sources of truth for the translation, and you don't want that. So in iOS, if you want to add support for locales, you go to the project settings, and you can easily add a locale there, and then there's localizable strings file where you can add your translations. And then if you want to change the language, well, you go to the settings and you select the app, and in there you change the language. And by the way, this is not going to work on an emulator, so you have to do it on device. On Android, for a long time there was no notion of changing the language of your app. It would just take the active locale from the system settings. But as of Android 13, this is fresh out of the oven, there's going to be this feature per app language preference, where it's going to allow you, same as in iOS, to change the active language of the app. All right, some final notes. React Native Localize or Expo Localization are some cool libraries that you can use to localize your apps. They give you necessary information for that. Intel APIs is a big topic in React Native, and as of React Native version 70 or 070, Intel APIs are going to be available in Hermes, on Android, and on iOS as well. Although I have to say that you might still have to use polyfills for some features, because on Android the support for Intel APIs is kind of dependent on the runtime version of the system. There are some cool plugins for IDEs. There are also plugins for ESLint. I also want to mention the FBT talk given by the developers from Facebook. And I think here I really just barely scratched the surface. The localization topic is kind of much more deeper. If you ask around, you'll see different people do it differently, and they have success and maybe less success. So I think it's a really interesting topic, and I encourage you to talk to your fellow developers about how they're doing it. And then maybe finally, one last thing. If you're designing for an international experience, you also have to keep in mind using correct fonts. And in this case, in languages such as mine, which have weird characters might render differently from the rest of the characters. So if anyone from Google is watching, I just want to let you know that the Czech characters don't look right in Chrome. All right. This is it from me. I hope you learned something new, and see you next time.